Hello, my friends and fellow soul defenders. My name is Christy, and this is Soul Bruises, a podcast devoted to taking a closer look at spiritual abuse. Whether you're a new listener or returning, I want to welcome you to a podcast that is addressing spiritual abuse out loud. I've been looking forward to this day since I started the Soul Bruises podcast. For the very first time, I am welcoming a guest host, sociology professor and cult expert, Dr. Janja Lalich. What an incredible human being. I was first drawn to Dr. Lalich while watching several cult documentaries in an attempt to understand the mindset of indoctrination and coercion in light of spiritual abuse. The same cult expert kept popping up during these interviews. That person was Dr. Lalich. I grew to really appreciate her insights, her wisdom, and her compassion for so many. She has extensive knowledge of cults, indoctrination, and coercion, and was incredibly gracious in sharing her valuable time and expertise. I could have talked with her for hours, so I was exceedingly grateful that she gave the Soul Bruises podcast even a small portion of her precious time. I think you'll find her quite fascinating. Janja Lalich, PhD, Professor Emerita of Sociology, is an international authority on cults and coercion. Researcher, author, and educator, she specializes in analysis of recruitment, indoctrination, and coercive methods of influence and control. Dr. Lalich is the author and/or co-author of 6 books, including the now classic Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships, now in its 3rd edition. Bounded Choice, True Believers in Charismatic Cults, elucidates her groundbreaking framework and theory on why cult members do the things that those on the outside cannot understand. Her research on children born and raised in a high-control group is the basis for escaping utopia, growing up in a cult, getting out, and starting over. Her work has been translated into Spanish, French, German, Italian, Polish, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Russian, Serbo-Croatian, Farsi, and Sinhala. In addition to working with survivors and families, she has been a keynote speaker at domestic and international conferences and leads workshops for government agencies, international intelligence agencies, private companies, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, as well as facilitating psychoeducational courses, workshops, and discussion groups for trauma survivors, families, and mental health professionals. She has also served as an expert witness in civil and criminal legal cases. She has been featured in countless interviews in print, online, and in podcasts, and has appeared in numerous documentaries on cults and related subjects. Dr. Lalich is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion at www.lalichcenter.org and may be reached at janja.l@lalichcenter.org. That's janja.l@lalichcenter.org. Today, I'm honored to speak with Dr. Janja Lalich, a renowned sociologist and an expert on cults and coercion. Her groundbreaking research has shed light on the complex dynamics of high-controlled groups, helping us better understand this often misunderstood phenomenon. Welcome, Dr. Janja Lalich. I really appreciate you coming to the Soul Bruises podcast. Thank you for accepting the invitation despite your incredibly busy schedule.
I truly am humbled with have the opportunity to speak with you.
Well,
And
well, thanks, Christy. I'm glad to be
yeah.
here.
Oh, awesome.
And
What
I
and
love the name of your podcast.
oh, thank you. Thank you so much. What I so respect and appreciate about you is your continued effort to educate the public, passing on your wisdom to others, and being so transparent and vulnerable about your own experience. So thank you for that. And for those that are meeting you for the first time, would you briefly share some defining moments of your past that brought you to where you are now?
Okay. Well, I would say probably the most defining moment is that I was in a cult myself for 10 years in the 70s and 80s. I was 30 when I joined, so I wasn't a kid. I had a college degree. I had been on a Fulbright fellowship to Europe. I lived in Europe. Anyway, I wasn't a kid. I wasn't naive. But I joined a left-wing political cult that supposedly we were going to get rid of racism and sexism and all those terrible isms, and we were going to create a better world, and that sounded wonderful to me. I mean, this was 1974, 75, when there was a lot of political activity happening in America, a lot of uh, movements like the Black Panthers and the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement. I mean, just millions of movements, plus the women's movement. So I just fell right into that when I moved to San Francisco. So that clearly is one of the things that brought me here, because when I got out, I was 41, and I felt like I was 15. And people who've been there will know, I just felt like a zombie. I felt like, I would have to go on these business lunches, and I just felt like an idiot because I didn't know what to talk about, and, all of that. Um, and then at night, I would try to write, and I would just sit and cry. And the people was like, anyway, eventually I found a really good therapist. I was really lucky. At the time, there was a cult clinic in New York. One in LA and one in New York. They're not there anymore, but the therapist there knew about cult phenomena and cult after effects. Yeah, so that, I finally sort of went through my recovery process, which was very difficult. I was suicidal a lot because I had been in high leadership. And so when I got out, I was like, how did I become that person? Like, oh my God. Uh, and so I tried to apologize to the people I could, but there's never enough of that. Anyway, I eventually went to grad school, got my PhD. And throughout all that time, I was doing cult related stuff. When I got out, which was 86, um, the only cults that were talked about at that time were religious cults. And so I had to go through this whole thing. Well, maybe we weren't a cult because we weren't religious.
Mm,
Um, and so I was one of the first people to start going to conferences and talking about other types of cults. Um, and so that was an important part of sort of my discovery. Um, anyway, I went to grad school, got my PhD, taught sociology for 20 years, and all of that time I was working. I was educating the public, as you mentioned, in whatever way I could. I was going to conferences, and I think probably the most important thing for me in terms of the question you asked, how did I get here? Um, was working with former cult members. I had support groups. I worked with a lot, less so when I got the teaching job because I was so busy. Our workload was very high, but, working one-on-one with cult members and also having support groups, it just really deepened my understanding of this whole phenomenon, right? Because people came from all different kinds of cults, and yet everything was the same, right? They maybe just called it something else.
right,
So
right.
anyway, that's kind of a winded answer to your question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Um, so I've always found cults to be both fascinating and unsettling. I used to think that I could never be directly involved in one, but the
Mm-hmm.
more I learned about them, the more easily I knew you could come right up to the edge of one without even realizing it.
Right.
And I personally have spent my life in a patriarchal, closed religious system,
Mm-hmm.
and so I know how subtle these lines can be. So I have to ask the question that I and so many people want answered by a cult expert. And I think you know what it is, and that is, what is a cult? What makes a cult a cult?
Uh, well, for me, there are several characteristics that I look for. One is, of course, the authoritarian leader who is sometimes considered charismatic. And that person is usually the founder of the group and purports to have some kind of salvation for you, whether that's religious or political, financial, whatever, right? They've got something that is going to help you achieve whatever, and only by being with them can you do it. So first, there's the authoritarian leader. Second, there is what I call the transcendent belief system. And what I mean by that is it's a belief system that has the answers to the past, the present, and the future. It doesn't need to be religious, but it has all the answers, and it is the only way, right? And sort of within that belief system, there is a requirement that you have to go through a change in order to be on this path, right? And so that is the setup for the whole indoctrination process, right? And then the final things that I look for are, and these are kind of sociology terms, but what I call systems of influence and systems of control. And what that means is systems of control obviously just means all the kind of rules and regulations, right? It might be what you can wear, where you should live, how many children you should have, how you should raise your children, whatever. The obvious rules. And that's, obviously to keep you in place and keep you compliant. But for me, the more powerful aspect are what I call the systems of influence. And these are the social psychological pressures on you to get you to submit. And so the cult will prey on, shame and guilt and love and anger and, all of these emotions. And of course, then offer you the answer. So you keep looking to the group as the answer or the leader. And that's where the real danger comes in, because the goal of all of that is to get rid of your sense of self and build a new self. And so the kind of loss of self-esteem, the loss of self-confidence, the eventual hatred of the self before the cult, and then the family or whatever, all of that is the really essential part of the indoctrination, that they have to get rid of everything you thought and believed before.
Okay. Wow. So many people assume that they can easily recognize a cult, but cults can look often surprisingly normal at first, probably. What are some common misconceptions? And you did name some of them people have about cults.
Well, I think one of the main ones is that all cults are religious. I think people still think that, when I think we've had plenty of examples now of other types. I think another myth is that only the young people join cults, and that's also not true. I mean, that was relatively true back in the 70s and 80s when we had what was called the Jesus movement. And there were some cults that got very big that were recruiting the Children of God, the Unification Church, groups like that, and focusing primarily on young people who were kind of in that hippie era wandering around. But today, actually, it's more people in their late 20s, 30s. I rarely get a call anymore about my kid in college has disappeared or something. I mean, that still happens. But now it's really because the cults have learned, for one, young people are too hard to control. And secondly, the cult wants people who already have skills, right? That they can help run the cult, they can run the businesses, they can bring in other people, they can earn money, whatever it is, right? So they typically want people who are already hopefully educated and have a career, have a way to bring in money. Or are influential in some way. So that's another myth about that basically anybody can join at any age, and the focus isn't still on young people. And there are plenty of cults in the corporate world and in the business world that disguise themselves as sort of management, leadership, training programs, etc. So I think those are the main sort of misconceptions.
Okay. Wow. So in defining a cult, you used your bounded choice theory
Hmm.
as a framework to explain this structure.
Hmm.
So could you elaborate on the four systems of your bounded choice and how they interact to create this self-sealing system, and then how those specifically erode the individual autonomy,
Hmm.
leading to a situation where everyone is encouraged to think alike?
Hmm. You got it.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
so my bounded choice theory, I'm sorry, came out of my graduate work, and it was actually my dissertation. Um, and the four characteristics are the ones I just mentioned: the
yeah.
leader, the authoritarian leader, the belief system, the controls, and the influences that interlock and work together to create, as you said, what I call the self-sealing system, which means the group is kind of closed in on itself. And then you as a person become closed in on yourself, right? Because what
Mm,
happens when you're in a cult is that you tend to model yourself after the leader and after the older members, right?
mhm.
Especially when you're a new recruit. And so this loss of sense of self is a very important part of gaining the conformity and compliance, which is what cults look for, right? So you've got these four characteristics that kind of seed off each other. And I would say not necessarily for everyone who's in a cult, but certainly for people who are in for any length of time, people who were born in, you get to a point where uh, you enter this state of mind that I call bounded choice, which means that any decision that you're going to make, you know that you can only make that decision in in conjunction with what the cult wants, right?
Yeah.
So, um, so your choices are limited, and you have what I call the illusion of choice. So this, obviously, I'm not talking about, there may be everyday decisions where obviously you can decide what to eat for lunch, or you might
Yeah.
decide what kind of car to buy, or something like that. But I'm talking about significant, substantial decisions like, can I criticize the leader? Can I leave? Can I go
Mhm.
outside and talk about this? Right? Those are things that are absolutely taboo. And so when you're in this state of mind, bounded choice, you know that you can only go that way, because to go any other way means, in a sense, literal or figurative, means death, right? To go against what the cult wants you to do, either by leaving on your own or perhaps getting kicked out, you're going to lose everything, right? You're going to lose your family potentially. You're going to lose your whole belief system. You may lose your income because you might be working for the cult. You'll lose where you live, And most people can't face that and don't want to face that, right?
Right.
So people will continually choose for the cult and choose for the cult because that's what they have to do. And so, um, what I think is helpful about this is that um, a lot of people, when they get out of a cult, they feel really ashamed. Like, oh, how could I have been so stupid? And why didn't I leave sooner? And da 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 da. And I think this helps explain that. And so, what what you what you gain from that is not just what happened to you, because you kind of know what happened to you, but it
Sure.
explains how it happened to you.
Yeah.
And that's the really important thing. That's what you need to unpack. And so, yeah, so that's my bounded choice theory.
Yeah, I love it because it really, like you talk about the shame and the guilt. You know, really, people that when they come out of it, that just having, you can put a why to it. Yeah, helping people through that process.
Hmm.
Yeah, so thank you for
Yeah.
that.
And I
Um,
do, and when I do work with people, or when I've led my online courses or workshops,
mhm,
I am a big promoter of writing. I think that writing
mhm,
things down is really helpful, whether it's keeping a journal or writing
mm,
essays or writing songs, whatever it is. And
yeah,
and by writing, I mean writing by hand, not on the computer.
mhm,
Because when you write by hand, you actually remember what you wrote, and it goes deeper into your mind than when you're just clicking on a computer.
Yeah.
And so I often will tell people, take my 4 characteristics, put them on a sheet of paper, and write underneath how your group exhibited that, right? What was your leader about? What did your leader believe? How did your leader act? What was the belief system? Where did it come from? Blah, 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 blah. And by doing that process of writing it all out, and then you look at it and you see, oh my God, you see the enormity of what you were trapped in. And I think that also helps get rid of the guilt and the shame, because how could you not have succumbed to that?
Right, right. So as I mentioned, I am a part of a closed group denomination, and that believes we have the truth. Some have thought my religion is a cult and have come short, and I've come short of saying so because I felt like it didn't quite meet all the requirements of being considered one. So my next question is, many groups exhibit some cult-like features, but what truly distinguishes a high control group from a fully fledged group, or fully fledged cult? Does your bounded choice theory require all 4 elements to fully be present for
Yes,
a group to
yes,
be considered a cult, or is it more of a
yes,
spectrum?
yes. It does. In my opinion, my
Yeah,
view is
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
it requires all 4. But there can be groups that exhibit some of these characteristics, but perhaps not as intensely as another group. So, especially when it comes to the squelching of one's autonomy, right? The squelching of one's own decision-making power, the squelching of your sense of self. The more that a group does that, the more cultic it's going to be. And so it may not have the super duper charismatic leader, right? It'll have some kind of leader who's usually authoritarian, but it's really these pressures on you that sort of seal the deal, so to speak.
Mhm.
And I just want to say something about charisma while we're talking about this, because I think
Yeah,
people have a misunderstanding of what charisma is.
okay.
Um, People tend to think that charisma is a trait that someone is born with, right? You're inherently a charismatic person, right? And so you
Mhm.
might see parents say, "Oh, my little 5-year-old, he's so charismatic," or "Oh, my high school daughter, she's so charismatic. She always has people around her." No, charisma is not an innate characteristic. Charisma is a social relationship. And it was first described back in the 1800s, I think, by a sociologist named Max Weber. And so, what I mean by a social relationship is that you are the one who attributes that characteristic to that person, right? You are the one that decides, oh my God, he's so charismatic, right? Once you do that, you give that person power over you, because you're basically saying that person has something that I don't. That person has something special, right? And so you, in a sense, by believing this person is charismatic, in a sense, you're already setting up this imbalance of power, this bad relationship, right? Um, and because of it being a social relationship, it's why in my book Take Back Your Life, there's a place where I say, charisma is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's why some people can think, God forbid, Donald Trump is very charismatic, right? And someone else would go, oh my God. Or somebody more obvious like John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King, or a movie star, right? And so some people can think that, and other people will think, no, I'm absolutely not, right? So it's not universal. It's you attributing that to the person.
Mhm. Wow, that's pretty profound. Um, okay, so cult leaders, much like religious institutions, they cultivate this us versus them mentality
Absolutely.
that strengthen this group identity. Could you describe the specific tactics that cult leaders use to create this division? And how does this mentality, once created, give them control over the members, erode the critical thinking, and
Mhm.
shape this perception that the outside world is dangerous and that
Right.
the inside the group is the only safe place?
Well, you said it right there. I
Hmm.
mean, it's basically a way to use fear as one of the control mechanisms.
Mhm.
And thought leaders do that by creating this us versus them mentality where, we are great and wonderful. We're the only ones who know this. We're safe with each other, and everything else out there is evil. And if you go out there, you're good. I mean, in my group, which was not in the least religious, we were told if you leave the cult, you're going to die in the gutter because we were a communist cult, right? Well, in America, everybody hates communists. So if you leave the cult, you'll never get a job. You'll never succeed. You'll just die lonely and poor in the gutter somewhere. Other groups may say, if you leave, something horrendous is going to happen to your family. Or they say, oh, if you leave, you're going to die in a car accident, right? And they might have an example of that they can use. They say, see, a blow left and he died in the car. Yeah, right? So using fear as a control technique is really important and is part of almost every group. And the us versus them, I mean, the way they do it is, picking on a segment of the population that you are supposed to hate or be afraid of, right? Or be against. I mean, and so we see this very blatantly today, right? Who are we hating? We're hating immigrants. We're hating Black people. We're starting to hate women. And so Trump was a master at this, at getting people to hate other people who weren't these nice white people. And actually, I'm not saying that the racism or whatever originated with Trump. I think people had in our country, unfortunately, a great deal of latent racism that Trump unleashed. And so during his first term, we did see a lot of violence, right? We did see these things being acted out, and we're going to see it for sure, and already are seeing it for sure, just in the last month and a half. So having that enemy is a really important part of keeping you there, making you feel special, right? Oh, I'm part of this elite. We're the only ones who are going to go to heaven or whatever. All of those things work together to tighten the screws, so to speak.
Okay. And one way I think that Donald Trump and others use, they use language. They will speak with immigrants as if they're animals. They'll
Absolutely
use terms that degrade them to a lower than a human.
And we know the
I
Nazis did that in Nazi.
Yes, absolutely. I read a book by Amanda Montell called Cultish. She emphasized that language is one of the most powerful tools that cults use. From your perspective as a sociologist, how does language shape the cult's influence and how it maintains control over its members?
Well, language is important. I don't necessarily agree with Amanda Montell. I had some real criticisms of her work.
Okay.
But
That's okay.
But language is important. And
Sure.
Robert Lifton was the first person to talk about this. Robert Lifton was a psychiatrist in the 50s who studied the Chinese communists and wrote a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, or if we want to call it brainwashing, because that's what the Chinese called it. They have this Chinese word, which I don't know how to say, but it meant washing the brain, right? It meant getting rid of, in that case, your bourgeois tendencies, right? And that's what we did in my group. We were for the proletariat. We hated anything bourgeois or middle class, whatever. So what Lifton pointed out is groups will have what he called, I'm sorry, a loaded language. And what that means is there are going to be certain terms, certain words, certain phrases that have a particularly powerful meaning that you are early on ingrained with understanding what these terms are, using these terms, and knowing that when you hear a certain term, you know exactly what to think or do. And so it's one of the ways in which your own critical thinking is being shut down, right? And your loss of autonomy, as I spoke about earlier. So this loaded language is very important, and every group is going to have different ones, different ways that they express that. One of my colleagues, who's a psychotherapist in Australia, who grew up in the Children of God, and who I met last fall at the cult conference in New Zealand. She just did this amazing piece of work where she took every different kind of cult and what were some of the phrases, what are some of the phrases used in that cult? And what is the power of that phrase? And it's a
Wow.
whole chart, which she has sent me and I'm going to be putting on my website.
Oh,
Because
wonderful.
when you look at it, you're like, wow, she has religious cults, political cults, the new age cults, the business cults, whatever. And it's just brilliant.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh,
And language,
fascinating.
language too. I mean, language, the other thing that loaded language does is that it isolates you from the outside world, right? And I'll give you an example. Years ago, God, this was in the 90s, I worked with a young woman who came out of a group that unfortunately, we used to call the garbage eaters because they would not take anything from society. They were like nomads. And the way they ate was to take food out of garbage bins, right? Eventually, it was figured out who the leader was, and then it came to be called the Jim Roberts Group. But anyway, they had their own language. They had just like every other cult. Well, a girl left that cult, a young woman, she actually got expelled. She asked to see her family, and the cult said, okay, you can go see your family. We're going to pick you up at such and such a telephone booth on Saturday at 3. And she went there Saturday at 3. And of course, they never came and they never came and they never came. And they just abandoned her. And she, of course, felt horrible. She lost everything. So she was staying with the family and they found me and they arranged for me to have sessions with her. And she talked because in this group, they were like super biblical. They had to take a different name of the biblical name, blah, blah, blah. So she talked like she was in the Bible, saith, doeth, whatever, however the Bible goes. Right? And she had a job at like a stationery store or something. And she said to me one day, she said, it's so strange. I get so upset because when I'm waiting on customers, they all kind of look at me like there's something wrong with me. And I said to her, do you realize that the way you speak is not the way the rest of us speak? And so they are, they're probably wondering what's wrong with you that you speak like that, or they might be making fun of you. And she had no clue that she was speaking that way. I mean, it was so natural to her, but at that point, and she had to really work on getting rid of that language.
Wow. You kind of get in a bubble, right?
Yeah.
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 Okay. So I've been personally meeting over Zoom with some members of the 2x2 church. And some of them have been going through some really difficult issues with family.
I'm sorry, which church?
2x2 church.
Oh, the 2x2s.
Yeah. And some of
that's not what you were in.
No, that is not what I've been in. And it's really bizarre how I've come across meeting them, a fellow person from my religion met up with their religion, and anyway, so we just connected. And anyways, but they're having some really difficult issues with family members. They've left the cult, and and so they had a question they wanted me to ask, and that is, what advice can you offer families trying to maintain relationships with a loved one deeply involved in a cult, especially when it comes to setting boundaries? And how can former members deal with harassment from family members still within the group?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a couple of aspects to that. I think first and foremost, the person, this person who left the cult, this former member, has to protect him or herself. That's the most important thing. So, and also I think people, when they leave cults, they have a tendency, in a lot of cases, they have a tendency to want to go back and get everyone else out, right? Get out the people you recruited, get your siblings out, right? And that's not your job. And I have a hard time getting people to understand that, but that is not your job. Your job when you get out is your recovery, right? It's a time when actually, for the first time in your life, maybe you can be, quote, selfish, right? Think about yourself and what you need and how to recover from the experience. And too often former cult members will become activists too soon. And that may cause them a great deal of stress and upset and breakdowns. And it also is a way that sometimes when former members of a group want to work together to do something, they kind of trigger each other because they remind each other of the cult, right? So becoming an activist too soon is something to really watch out for. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to one's family, right? Okay, so you want to still stay in touch with your family if you're even allowed to. In many cases, you're not even allowed to, right? I think the important thing is to tread very carefully, to not talk about cult stuff, I think, again, it'll depend if you were born in, if they were born in, if you're second, third generation, which in the 2x2s is often third, or even fourth generation, right? So it just goes way back, right? So you have to figure out a way. So I guess what I'm saying is, because of that, you don't have any prior experiences, right? Like when I talk with families who have someone in a cult and I want to give them a bit of advice about what to do, right? I always say, remind that person of things you did before he or she joined the cult, right? Did you go fishing? Did you, go to the fair? Did you, whatever? And try to do those things with the person to remind them that there was another way to be, right? And don't be confrontational. Don't talk about stuff like that. Just have a good time together, and on the holidays, send them their favorite cookies or whatever, right? So that's a little easier to do when you're not the former member, right? You're just the mom or dad or the aunt or uncle or whatever, right? When it's your mom or dad who are in the cult and you leave, or your siblings, if you are allowed to see them and be with them, I think the important thing is similar to what I'd tell other people, is to not be confrontational, try to do fun things together. As I say, tug at their emotional heartstrings, right? Because it's your emotions that are most manipulated, right? Try to reawaken, something in them. And you just have to do it in tiptoes. I mean, I had a brother who was very racist, very right-wing, very racist. And it was, for a long time, it was impossible. And this is not the same, obviously, but for a long time, it was just impossible to talk to him, right? And he would bait me and, all of that. He was an older brother. And finally, when everyone else in our family died and we were the only two left alive, I think we kind of realized that we better kind of hang on to each other a little bit. So we kind of came to this understanding of things we weren't going to talk about, right? We weren't going to talk about immigrants. We weren't going to talk about race. We weren't going to, and that really worked. And we actually were very close in many other ways. I still thought he was a racist. I mean, he's passed now, and that. And on the other hand, I loved him as my brother. But so I think that the idea of finding that middle ground where you can see your family or talk to them on the phone or whatever it is, and try to, I use this, my shelf metaphor, right? I think everybody who's in a cult has hesitations and has doubts. Now, that may be a little harder for second and third generation because it's all they've known. But people do seem to have some kind of inner sense of morality that they're born with. And that's why so many children of cults are leaving now, because they go, wait a minute, something's not right here, right? And how do they figure that out? I don't know. It's some kind of innate resilience. So, but I do believe that everybody has doubts, right? Or they think, I don't know, probably shouldn't have done that. Or maybe we shouldn't have robbed that store. Or maybe we shouldn't have, whatever it is, right? And I think that the way I see it is you want to, so they'll have doubts and they can't express them, right? They can't say to their partner or to someone else, hey, don't you think the leader's a little cuckoo? I mean, you can't say that. So you put all these doubts on this shelf in the back of your head, right? And one day, too many things happen and the shelf breaks. Now, when the shelf breaks, you don't necessarily say, I'm in a cult, but you know that something's wrong. And you know that maybe what being in this group is not in your best interest, that this is not healthy. And then if you're lucky, you can start to work your way out, which again is tough depending on what kind of resources you think exist out there. So what I say to people trying to communicate with people in the cult is try to plant seeds on that shelf, little bitty things on that shelf that are going to make them doubt more, going to make them question more. And I think that's the best we can do.
That connect with them emotionally also. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good information.
I mean, I wish I had magic answers, but
oh, I know.
there are no magic answers.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh,
And the 2x2s is an amazing group. I mean,
yeah.
when I first heard about them, probably 5 years ago, because a student at the university had grown up in it, and I was blown away when she started telling me about the 2x2s and how huge, how many members around the world.
Yes.
And only recently has stuff started coming out. So there are criminal charges. There was a lot of sexual abuse of children, the typical stuff. And so people are learning about the 2x2s. And of course, they're called the 2x2s because they didn't have a name. They didn't have churches. They did everything in people's homes. They were very underground in a way, but they were working in the community. And I was thinking, it was actually, I did that talk with former 2x2s, which is on YouTube, which you mentioned. And I thought, here's this group that's been around for decades, centuries almost, that has hundreds of thousands of members around the world, literally around the world. And we knew nothing about it. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I had never heard of the 2x2s until 4 years ago, right? So it makes me wonder, how many other groups are there out there like that we don't even know about?
Right, because you're even in the field of cult.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that children being born in cults is something that's really holds a special place in your heart. The indoctrination of that experience from birth is deeply profound. How does being raised in a cult impact the children's development, their sense of identity, and that long-term critical thinking skills?
Yeah. So normally in the quote normal world,
Yeah. What's that?
from the time we're born, we all go through these developmental stages, and the person who wrote about this was a psychotherapist, I guess, named Erik Erikson, Erkson, and he outlined, I think it was 8 or 9 stages, right, that are by years. So and each stage is maybe 3 years, right? So you go from birth to 3 years old, 4 to 6, whatever. And during that stage, there are things that you are supposed to accomplish, that are supposed to be accomplished. And if they are, then you graduate to the next phase, right? So there are things like learning to trust, stuff like that. People can look online. You can find his whole chart. So what happens in cults is, obviously, you're not able to have control over your own developmental process. And in most cases, neither are your parents, right? Because they're probably brainwashed as well, right? If they're in the cult. So the most important part, I think the part that's the most effective for the cult is the stage of adolescence. And I think the years are 11 to 13 and 13 to 15, something like that. Those are the stages when you are really trying to figure out who you are, right? So this is when, you go get a tattoo or you get a ring in your nose, or you don't want to sit down and have dinner with your parents anymore. And you make friends with somebody at school and you decide, no, that's not who I want to be friends with. I'm going to go over here. Right. And you're trying to figure out who you are and what you believe in. Right. And it's that process that's called individuation, separating from your parents
Yes.
and becoming your own person, your own self. Well, in the cult, that doesn't happen. And so those phases, especially those two phases of, let's say 11 to 15, which are so crucial, it's completely controlled by the cult and what the cult wants you to be. So in a sense, you have this stunted development. And often what happens when people leave is, in many ways, they still act like adolescents because they never got past that stage, right? And you don't learn the life skills that those of us who aren't in a cult learn, right? We learn how to deal with the bully at school. We learn how to skip school. We learn how to take a criticism. These social skills that you learn by trial and error all through your life. I still remember the girl who hit me in the eye with her baton, and I was like, damn you, and I actually said, damn. And I was like in 4th grade or something. So, so what I'm saying is, for people born in a cult, you don't develop those skills, those innate, what become innate skills about how to function in the world. And so the tragedy of that is, people born in cults leave and they don't know how to function in the world. They don't know where to get help. Sometimes they don't even know their real name. They don't have birth certificates, and they don't know how to navigate the external world. And so they get depressed, they get suicidal, they end up doing drugs, they end up selling themselves for sex, they end up living on the streets. All this shit happens. In part because we don't have any social resources for people coming out of cults. And that's my pet peeve.
Okay.
Someone can go to a domestic violence shelter and they'll get turned away because they don't qualify, right? So where do these people go? Where do they go? And they're leaving cults in droves now, and have been. And so I do call this, the number one public health issue that we just are not dealing with in our society, and not in any society that I'm aware of. And so that's the real criminal part of the people born and raised in, which is just tragic, really tragic.
And you kind of addressed that in your book, Escaping Utopia, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something that surprises me. If you have any people out there who are thinking of going to grad school or anything like that.
Yeah.
That book came out in 2017, I think, Escaping Utopia. I interviewed 67 or 68 people who grew up in a cult, right? As far as I know, that is still the only published research on the experiences of children in cults, other than a book that was done by some of the cult apologists, which we don't pay any attention to.
Right.
So, all these years later, and we need more research, we need more statistics so that we can go to people and say, start a shelter for these people, do something, put some of the civic budget into helping this population, right? So if anyone's thinking of going to school, these are the things you want to study. These are the statistics you want to build. We're trying to work right now on trying to figure out the statistics of suicide. How many suicides happen? It's unbelievable. I mean, obviously, there's also deaths that happen because of medical neglect, which is very common, or maybe accidents. But both suicide ideation and actual suicides, the rates are so high and higher than the general public.
Yeah.
But we need proven studies to show those statistics, right? I have a couple of mentions in my work, but we need so much more.
Wow. Thank you for plugging that. Yeah. Because you never know.
And I just want to add,
please do.
I'm about to be 80 years old. I'm going to be 80 years old
way.
in April.
That's awesome.
And I can't do this forever. At some point I have to stop, right? And right now I'm even cutting back some because the board of my nonprofit is like, Janja, you've got to have a life. You've got to stop.
Mhm.
So we need people to rise to the occasion. We need people to take its banner. And that's why I'm so adamant about like helping train people and educate people in these things, because the cults aren't going to go away. And we need the so-called experts, people like myself who are knowledgeable to educate the public, to help the former members, whatever. So that's my pitch.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, and we mentioned this earlier. I know not all cults are religious, but for those that are, what's the difference between a religious cult and a healthy religion?
Okay. I get asked that a lot.
I bet you do.
So,
Uh,
in my opinion, first of all, a healthy religion is going to have you worshiping some kind of higher being, whether that's Allah or God or a tree or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You're not worshiping this human being right in front of you, right? That is not the person who has control over your life, right? So that's number one, the difference. And secondly, a healthy religion, all religions are going to have, you know, sort of guidelines to live by, right? Norms that particular church wants to emphasize, right? So whether it's somebody moves into your neighborhood, take them a cake and welcome to the neighborhood, or for example, the Catholic Church, don't use contraception, right? But they're not going into your bedroom to see if you're using contraception, right? They're not going to chastise you because you didn't take the cake to your new neighbors, right? Whereas if that's a healthy religion, if you're in a cultic religion, there's no bending those rules, right? You got to do what they say, or there's consequences. So that's certainly another difference. Also, I think if you leave a healthy religion, in most cases, you're not going to be ostracized. You're not going to be shunned. People are not going to stop talking to you if they see you in the grocery store, right? People pretty much respect each other's religious decisions, right? But in a cult, again, people leave a cult and they are criticized. They are made to be demons. Terrible things are said about them back inside the cult. And in many, many cases, no one is allowed to have any contact with them. So I think those are probably the three main differences that I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some key signs of indoctrination and that you could look for? And if we're worried about ourselves or others that we care for?
Yeah, I think indoctrination is, as I said earlier, it's all about getting rid of you, right? Getting you to
Okay.
give up your sense of self, right?
Yeah.
So I think, one sign of that, of an indoctrination program, one sign is almost always the fact that you cannot criticize the leader. Whatever the leader says goes, or whatever documents the leader wrote, that is now the Bible, whatever, right? So if you're joining something and everybody's just worshiping and praising and falling down all over themselves for this man or woman who's up on the stage, that should be a sign to get the hell out of there, right?
Yeah.
Also, I think if there's no transparency, right? You don't know where the money goes. You don't know, how decisions are made. There's no obvious chain of command with measures of accountability to hold people accountable, right? And I think also with indoctrination, a lot of times what'll happen in groups is they will assign, if you're a new person, they will assign someone who's been in the group a while to be in my cult, we called it your one help. In some groups, it's your disciple, right? Your discipling memberships, right? So you have this person who has been in the cult for a while, who's supposed to help you and guide you and be there to answer your questions, right? But what happens is you might say to that person, I don't know, this seems a little cuckoo to me. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to go back to the leadership and say, Janja just said this was really cuckoo. We got to take care of her, right? So they cannot be trusted, right? And so that's an early way that you learn you cannot trust anybody. And you
Okay.
cannot even trust your own spouse or your children or
Mm,
anybody,
mm,
because the only loyalty, the only allegiance is to the leader.
to the leader. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. This
And of
is,
course, let me
you know,
just add, I think one
yeah.
other classic indoctrination technique
Yeah.
is using what I call high arousal techniques.
Mm,
And so that could be chanting, it could be meditating, it could be speaking in tongues, whatever. So
mhm.
many cults will do that too. And again, when you're speaking in tongues for a long period of time, when you're meditating for a long period of time, when you're doing whatever for a long period of time, your critical thinking shuts down, and you don't
Mm,
your mind isn't really sharp anymore, right? You're just
yeah.
spaced out, right?
Yeah.
And in that spaced out phase is when you are more susceptible, right? And it's also very contagious. So again, if we go back to Trump, when you think about the Trump rallies, right? He was great at this because people would be, lock her up. And they're all yelling, lock her up, lock her up. And it
Mhm.
gets into a kind of frenzy, right? It's the madness, what we call the madness of the crowd. So using those high arousal techniques, and they will be in different ways. They'll be different in a management training program than in say a church that speaks in tongues. But
Yeah.
that's another thing to watch out for, is
Okay.
when you're expected to participate excessively in something that is shutting down your critical thinking.
Okay. Okay. Um, this is definitely timely. It seems that throughout history, when both political and religious powers mix and react defensively to outside perspectives, this dynamic can easily create a cult-like atmosphere. Would Christian nationalism be an
Yeah.
example of this? And does this threaten religious freedom and individual rights? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
If you have
absolutely.
some. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the
Yeah.
Christian nationalism is probably the scariest thing that's happened in quite a long time in this country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think people don't realize how long they have been working on that.
Yeah.
And organizing themselves and inserting themselves into both local and federal governments, school boards, right? Oh, suddenly we have book banning. I mean, in Florida, they ban Anne Frank's book. Anne Frank. I mean, come on, right? And obviously, they're banning The Handmaid's Tale, right? Because that's what they're
Mm.
creating. So the Christian nationalists are organized. They are Their belief system spreads across a lot of different religious groups. It's not just one group. And their belief system is very much based on hate and on violence, right? And so that's exactly what's happening right now in our country. And there's a couple of really good books. I just read a great book called The Flag and the Cross. So if
Mm.
people want to learn kind of more systematically how this happened in our country,
Yeah.
The Flag and the Cross is a really good book. And it's
Okay.
easy to read. It's short. Another excellent book is called The Family, by a journalist called Jeff Charlotte,
Yeah.
Sharlet. And he exposed that there is a group in Washington, D.C. called The Family, where they have a house on whatever street. And
B Street.
yeah,
The
and
documentary is really good about this too. Yeah.
and they are the people who started the prayer breakfast. So the
Mm.
fact that our government even has prayer breakfast is such a violation of the separation of church and state.
Right.
Not
Right.
to mention that now we have some cuckoo woman who's like the what is her title? Do you remember? She's like the religious czar. The new
You're
American.
talking about Paula White, correct?
Yeah, Paula White,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so this is really scary, because these aren't do-gooder Christians. These are
No.
hateful Christians,
Yes.
and
Yes.
they want to shut down women.
Mhm.
They want to get rid of immigrants.
Mm.
They want to serve only themselves. They want women to have as many babies as possible. They want women to have no rights. It's really scary. I don't
Yeah.
know if you saw the thing that just happened in Idaho. There was a a town hall
No.
meeting or a city council meeting in Idaho the other day.
Okay.
And whatever the guy on the stage was saying, I don't know, but this woman in the audience spoke out. And they sent these brown shirts, I call them brown shirts. They sent these militia guys from a private security firm to take her out of the auditorium or whatever it was. They went over, she resisted. There were 3 of them. They got her down on the ground. They zip tied her. They
Oh.
dragged her out. They said she was going to be criminally charged for disrupting this meeting. The guy up on stage was making fun of her, laughing about her, calling her a little girl who didn't want to do what she was told. And this entire room full of people, not a single person stood up to help her. Not a
Silent.
single person. Not a man, but also not a woman. And this is what we need to be afraid of,
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's
Yeah.
what happened in Nazi Germany.
Yes.
People
Yeah.
just pretended it wasn't happening.
Yeah. It's not only the act, but the silence and the
Yes.
compliance. Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So many people that leave or escape a cult believe that they have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or moral injury, or both. Can you explain the difference between the two, and how do these play into the healing process?
Right. So, so there's 2 types of PTSD. There's regular PTSD, and there's what we now call complex PTSD, which was first written about by a therapist named Judith Herman way back when. In fact, it was one of the books that helped me in the 90s. And most cult members are going to have complex PTSD. And there's several problems related to that. One is that a lot of therapists don't even know about this or know how to treat it. So let me explain the difference. PTSD is something tragic, horrendous, awful happens to you. So maybe you are walking down the street with your kid and the kid gets killed in a car accident. And that's incredibly traumatic. And you're going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. Or you're a soldier that goes off to war and you're killing a bunch of people, but they're strangers, right? But it's still of traumatic experience, right? But it's post-traumatic. It's not complex. What makes something complex PTSD is longevity, how long it happens to you, it's going on with you, and the fact that it's being done by people you know, and you are doing it to people you know. And that's where the moral injury comes in,
Okay.
right? So complex PTSD is about, as I was saying earlier, you're in a cult, you can't trust anyone, right? Your best friend's going to turn you in, your spouse, your children, whatever, right? And you may be expected to punish your own child. So these things that are happening are done by people you know, and you are doing things to people you know. And in most cases, it'll last for a while. So that's the longevity. And the moral injury is that aspect of either doing things or seeing things that you couldn't do anything about. So when you leave, you have such enormous guilt and shame. It's when I talked earlier about being suicidal when I got out, because I was in leadership.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. It's like hating yourself because of the things you know you did or the things you didn't try to stop. Yet you wouldn't have been able to try to stop them, right? For all the reasons we've already talked about.
Yeah.
But that is probably the biggest hurdle for former cult members to go through in their recovery process, because it's about forgiving yourself, right?
Okay.
We always hear, oh, you have to forgive people. You have to forgive people, right? And you'll see these people, in trials where some guy killed their daughter and he's going to prison for life. And they say, oh, we forgive him. Nah, you don't ever have to forgive your cult leader, right? You have to forgive yourself, because in a cult, and this is again the moral injury, in a cult, we all become perpetrators. You have to, right? It's the only way you can survive. It's the way it works, right? You're trained and you're indoctrinated to do it all to each other, right? And so that that sense of being a perpetrator is what's really hard for people to accept, and that's, and there's a lot of people who don't want to look at that. And so they will never really complete their recovery process. And they may end up being stunted in a number of ways as life goes on in their relationships or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What advice would you give those who have physically left a cult but still feel mentally trapped by it? They feel isolated and lost without the system that they once belonged to. How
Mhm.
would you help them navigate this transition? What would you offer them?
Yeah, I think, and I know it's hard because I know a lot of people will, often giving up the cult leader is the last thing people do. They're like, they know horrible things happened. They know it was awful, but they'll say, oh, but he really meant to do well. And he really was so special. And I had these amazing experiences when he touched my head or whatever. Right. And so giving up the cult leader, realizing who the cult leader really was, probably a malignant narcissist, is important to do for your own recovery. But also people will, especially people who were in, I would say, Eastern cults where they did a lot of meditation or they did yoga or they did whatever. And I'm not criticizing those practices, but often what'll happen is when they leave the cult, they feel like, oh, I've got to meditate, because they're so used to it. It's like it's ingrained in them at this point. Like, oh, I got to do this 3 hours a day or whatever. And so the important thing is to try to stop doing those things. Just stop doing the things that you had to do in the cult, the rituals, the kind of ritualistic stuff.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, change your language. You may have to change the way you eat, depending on if there were certain restrictions in the cult or not. And that's why I think when I said way at the beginning about writing, that's why I think making a list, like these are all the things I was trained to do that I no longer want to do. And if you have a list, you can kind of systematically then work on that list. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Wow. So as someone who has dedicated their life, like yourself, to studying and helping individuals affected by cults, what legacy do you hope to leave in this field? What contributions do you envision your work making to the broader conversation about cults and their impact?
well, I think certainly my published books are
Mm,
one legacy that I hope they will stay in print, which is always an issue.
yeah.
um, but about 2 years ago, I started a nonprofit organization called the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion. And I saw that as a way of trying to establish a legacy so that there would be people who could carry on after I'm gone. Um, we're making it so that, say, the royalties from the book don't come to me; they go to the Lalich Center, right? So that we can pay for our Google Drive and our Zoom account and all these things that these monthly expenses that you have to pay for. And so I think hopefully the Lalich Center will continue. We've just brought 2 new people on board who are younger because most the other board members were kind of my age. So we got a couple 40-year-olds in there. Um, and, and I think just being out there, what I'm doing is training them to be able to do the journalistic interviews. I get called all the time to do an interview with the media or do a podcast like with you. And so I'm trying to train them to start taking those things. Like, a newspaper contacts me. I say to them, I'd like you to contact Adam Kuntz. He's a professor of philosophy. He's a former Mormon. So I'm trying to have it not be all about me. Because we need many, many, many people qualified to do this work. So I guess that's it. And then also we're next week, actually, we're recording a course for therapists where they will be able to get continuing ed credits. And it's going to be a webinar, which means once we record it, it's out there and people can take it whenever they want. It's not like a one-time shot where it's live and,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there's drawbacks to doing a recording. People can't ask me questions or whatever. But
Right.
still, it's got 7 segments and it'll be a way for therapists, social workers, whoever, It's approved by the American Psychological Association. So that'll be out there, and hopefully that'll stay out there for quite a while.
And that'll be on your lalichcenter.org?
Yeah, that'll be,
Okay.
yes. And we actually, if people are interested, we are keeping a list of therapists or social workers, whatever, who want to know when the thing is launched. So what you can do is email info@lalichcenter.org, and those go to the admin person and tell her you want to be on the therapist list. That way, when it's released, hopefully in a month or two, you'll get an email saying it's ready now. Here's how you can sign up.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion at lalichcenter.org. So, Dr. Lalich, I can't thank you enough for this precious time and your extensive knowledge on this complicated topic. I have learned so much today, and I knew I would. And I know this will benefit so many others. I'm so very grateful. If you're ever in Maine, I would love to have a cup of coffee with you.
Well, yeah,
But,
and you've got that great governor, right?
yes, we do. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Okay,
All
I'm
right.
glad we got to do this. And
Oh,
stay in touch.
thank you so much. It means so
Yeah.
much to me.
Okay,
All
ciao.
right, take
Bye.
care. Bye.
I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast interview of Dr. Janja Lalich. I hope you learned a lot from what she had to say today. I know I certainly did. I hope you'll check out her website at lalichcenter.org and consider donating to their cause. None of us are immune to falling into the arms of a cult, so education is so key. And I'm grateful that Dr. Lalich continues to share her expertise with so many. I hope you'll consider sharing this podcast episode with family and friends who you think might find it helpful. This is Christy Hodson, and you've been listening to the Soul Bruises podcast. Until we connect again, be human, be kind, be both.